They didn't kidnap babies, they bought them. In Victorian England, a crying child wasn't always a tragedy. Sometimes, it was a transaction. Mothers signed papers, money changed hands. And within weeks, those babies simply disappeared. This wasn't rumor. It wasn't myth. It was an industry. And the people running it called themselves caregivers, the business of selling innocence. In the late 1800s, Victorian England was a place of progress and contradiction. Railways stretched across the country. Factories roared with industrial power. London became the heart of an empire. But beneath the pride and polished streets, poverty suffocated thousands. Unmarried mothers were especially vulnerable. If a woman became pregnant outside of marriage, society saw her as immoral. Jobs vanished overnight. Families disowned daughters. Landlords evicted tenants. Respectability meant survival. Once that was gone, so was safety. And in that desperation, a quiet solution began to spread. Advertisements appeared in newspapers. Respectable lady willing to adopt infant. Private care provided for unwanted children. Discretion guaranteed to a terrified mother with no money and no support. Those words sounded like mercy. The women who placed those ads called themselves baby farmers. The term sounded harmless, almost nurturing, as if babies were being raised, tended, protected. But the truth behind that name was far darker. For a single payment, often between £5 and £15, a significant sum at the time, a baby farmer would take full custody. No ongoing support required, no visits, no future responsibility. For the mother, it meant freedom from shame. For the baby farmer, it meant profit, and profit depended on minimizing cost. Unlike formal adoption systems today, there were almost no regulations, no home inspections, no medical oversight, no tracking. Once money changed hands, the baby was no longer society's concern. Many baby farmers operated in overcrowded houses on the edges of cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham. Neighbors often saw prams arriving, but rarely saw children growing older. Infants require constant care, food, warmth, attention, medical treatment. All of that cost money, and money reduced profit. Some baby farmers would feed children watered-down milk. Others gave them cheap narcotic syrups, substances like laudanum, to keep them quiet 4 hours. A silent baby required less effort. Less noise meant fewer complaints from neighbors. But drugged infants don't cry. They also stop breathing. In many cases, babies simply weakened. Malnutrition hollowed their small bodies. Illness spread quickly in cramped, unsanitary rooms. Without proper care, survival rates plummeted. Death certificates were easy to obtain in an era where infant mortality was already tragically common. A doctor might sign off on natural causes. Few questions were asked, and so the system sustained itself. More advertisements, more desperate mothers, more quiet burials. Some baby farmers did attempt to place children in legitimate homes, especially if the infant was healthy. But many realized something chilling. A dead child required no ongoing expense. The darker operators calculated carefully. One upfront payment, minimal food, minimal care, maximum margin. It was economics applied to innocence. One of the most infamous cases would later expose the brutality of the practice. But in these early years, the industry thrived in shadows. Police rarely intervened unless neighbors reported something suspicious. And even then, proving wrongdoing was difficult. Infant mortality rates in Victorian England were already high. Poverty, disease, and poor sanitation claimed thousands of young lives. Baby farmers hid behind statistics. They blended into tragedy. But whispers began to circulate to many funerals, to many small coffins leaving certain addresses, to many women claiming they had adopted out a child, only too late to discover there was no record. Journalists slowly picked up on the pattern. Some newspapers began using harsher language. Instead of baby farmers, They started writing words like child traffickers and murderers. Public outrage simmered, but outrage alone did not shut down the business, because the demand was still there. Victorian society punished women for poverty and pregnancy outside marriage. It offered little support. Workhouses were brutal. Illegitimate children were stigmatized. Survival often meant choosing between starvation and surrender. Baby farming did not exist in isolation. It existed because society created the conditions for it. And as long as mothers were desperate and regulation remained weak, the business continued to grow. What began as private arrangements quietly evolved into a system, a marketplace where human life had a price. And accountability barely existed, but eventually, one case would force the country to look directly at what it had allowed to happen. And when authorities finally opened the doors of one particular house, they discovered something that would horrify Victorian England and change adoption laws forever. The industry of silence was about to be exposed. The woman who turned death into a business. By the time the police finally acted, the rumours had already spread across London. Too many infants had passed through one particular house. Too many mothers had handed over their babies and never received so much as a letter in return. Too many tiny graves had appeared without names. Her name was Amelia Dyer. On the surface, she seemed ordinary, middle-aged, soft-spoken, respectable enough to avoid suspicion. She presented herself as a trained nurse, a caregiver who could provide loving homes for unwanted infants. In reality, she had perfected something far more sinister. Amelia Dyer understood the economics of baby farming better than anyone. In the beginning, she operated like many others. She accepted a one-time payment from desperate mothers and promised long-term care. But she quickly realized something brutal. Feeding a child 4 years destroyed profit margins. Even keeping a baby alive for several months reduced earnings. So she removed the expense. Unlike some baby farmers who allowed neglect to do the killing slowly, Dyer chose speed and efficiency. She used white tape. It was cheap, strong, silent. Investigators would later learn that she strangled infants within hours, sometimes minutes, of receiving them. There was no prolonged suffering from starvation, no waiting for illness, just immediate elimination of cost. Once dead, the babies were wrapped carefully, weighted, and discarded in rivers, especially the Thames. Water concealed evidence. Bodies drifted away. Many were never recovered, and the mothers, they received letters. Dyer wrote cheerful updates in careful handwriting. The baby is thriving. She has such a sweet smile. He's growing stronger every day. The deception allowed her to accept more children without raising suspicion. Mothers believed their babies were alive somewhere safe. Some even sent additional money. For nearly 30 years, she operated in this manner, moving between cities whenever suspicion grew. She used aliases, rented new houses, posted fresh advertisements in local newspapers. Married couple desires child, good Christian home waiting. Each ad was a trap. It is estimated that Amelia Dyer may have killed hundreds of infants. Some historians believe the number could exceed 300. Exact figures will never be known. Many victims were never identified. Many were never found. What finally exposed her was not conscience. It was carelessness. In 1896, a bargeman on the River Thames discovered a small package floating near Reading. Inside was the body of a baby girl. The bundle was wrapped tightly, weighted with bricks. But what the killer failed to notice was a scrap of paper tucked inside. On it was a name and an address. The police traced it. When they arrived at the house linked to the paper, they found more evidence: letters from mothers, adoption agreements, baby clothing, but no children. Under pressure, Dyer confessed calmly. She admitted to killing infants. She described using tape. She showed no emotional distress while explaining her methods. To her, it had become procedural, mechanical, business. The trial shocked Britain. Newspapers printed horrifying details, illustrations of the tape, sketches of recovered bodies. The term baby farming suddenly carried a weight the public could no longer ignore. People who had once dismissed the practice as unfortunate but necessary now saw it for what it could become: industrialized murder. Hidden behind social hypocrisy, during the proceedings, the scale of her deception became clear. She had exploited not just children, but the shame imposed on women. Society had created secrecy around illegitimate births. That secrecy became her shield. Many mothers were too embarrassed to report suspicions, too afraid to publicly admit they had given up a child, too ashamed to approach authorities. Dyer relied on silence. But once exposed, silence shattered. Public fury erupted. Editorials demanded reform. Questions flooded Parliament. How had this gone on for decades? Why were there no inspections? Why were private adoptions unregulated? How many other baby farmers were still operating? The answers were uncomfortable. Infant mortality in Victorian England was already staggeringly high. Poor sanitation, malnutrition, and disease meant many babies died naturally. That statistical reality allowed killers like Dyer to blend in. Death did not look suspicious in an era accustomed to it. But the discovery of bodies in the river forced officials to confront something undeniable. These were not natural tragedies. They were calculated acts. In court, Dyer remained eerily composed. She did not claim insanity. She did not break down dramatically. She acknowledged what she had done in fragments, as if describing routine chores. In 1896, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. When she was hanged at Newgate Prison, newspapers described the execution as swift. Crowds gathered outside. Some demanded harsher punishment. Others stood in stunned silence. Yet even her execution did not end the practice entirely. It exposed it. After the trial, investigations uncovered additional baby farmers across Britain. Some were negligent, some were abusive. A few were equally lethal. Dyer was not an isolated monster. She was the most extreme symptom of a wider failure. And that failure was systemic. Victorian society had criminalized poverty and punished unwed motherhood. It offered limited support systems. Adoption laws were weak. Oversight was minimal. Into that vacuum stepped opportunists who turned compassion into commerce. The case forced lawmakers to reconsider. Public pressure led to tighter regulations. Inspections increased. Record-keeping improved. Private adoption practices faced scrutiny. It would take years, even decades, for comprehensive reform, but the turning point had arrived. For the first time, the British public saw clearly that behind polite newspaper advertisements could hide something lethal. Amelia Dyer did not invent baby farming. She industrialized its darkest potential. And the horror of what she had done forced an empire to admit that progress and cruelty had grown side by side. But even as laws changed, one question lingered, unsettling and difficult. How many other infants had vanished quietly before the river finally gave one back? The business of selling innocence had been profitable, and for far too long, it had been protected by silence. By the time newspapers stopped printing Amelia Dyer's name, something far more disturbing had settled over Britain. It wasn't just horror, it was realization. Because the truth was this: she did not operate in darkness, she operated in daylight. For decades, baby farming had been openly advertised in newspapers. Small, polite lines printed between job listings and boarding houses. Infant wanted for adoption, good home for a baby, respectable woman willing to care for child. No background checks, no inspections, no oversight. Anyone with a rented room and convincing handwriting could become a caregiver. And why did it exist? Because Victorian England created the perfect conditions for it. Unmarried mothers were shamed publicly. Employment was scarce. Wages for women were often starvation level. Many were domestic servants, and pregnancy meant instant dismissal. There were no welfare systems, no structured adoption agencies, no safe alternatives. So when a frightened young woman saw an advertisement promising a loving home for her baby, in exchange for a one-time payment, it felt like salvation. Baby farmers did not need to kidnap children. They were handed to them. That is the part history struggles with. It wasn't hidden in some underground criminal network. It was legalized neglect wrapped in polite language. Infant mortality rates in Victorian Britain were already high. In some areas, 1 in 5 babies died before their first birthday. Disease was common, sanitation was poor. Doctors were limited, so when a baby died in a foster home, few asked questions. Death blended into statistics, and statistics protected killers. But after the Dyer trial, investigators began reopening old cases. Patterns emerged. Houses that had taken dozens of infants without ever producing a living toddler. Women who moved frequently. Rivers that had carried more than debris. Suddenly, what had been dismissed as tragic misfortune looked like coordinated exploitation. Public outrage pushed Parliament Act. The Infant Life Protection Act was strengthened. Registration requirements expanded. Local authorities were given power to inspect homes caring for multiple infants. Records became mandatory. For the first time, private childcare entered the realm of public responsibility. It was a turning point, but not an instant fix. Even after reform, enforcement was uneven. Rural areas lagged behind cities. Corruption existed. Some baby farmers simply adapted, becoming more discreet, more selective. But something fundamental had shifted. Society could no longer pretend it didn't know. Newspapers began printing warning editorials. Clergy spoke from pulpits about moral responsibility. Social reformers used the scandal to advocate for women's shelters and child welfare services. The Dyer case had cracked something open, yet here is the most unsettling truth of all. If Victorian society had treated unmarried mothers with dignity, if it had offered support instead of shame, baby farming might never have flourished. The demand created the supply, desperation created the market, and the market created monsters. History often isolates villains. It names them, it hangs them, it closes the file. But in this story, the villain was larger than one woman with tape and river stones. It was a culture that preferred secrecy over support. It was a legal system that ignored slow suffering. It was an economy that valued reputation more than life. Amelia Dyer became the face of horror because she was extreme. But she thrived because she was enabled. Even today, historians debate the exact number of her victims. Some estimate 200. Others believe it could be far higher. Records were incomplete. Many children were never formally registered at birth. They existed only briefly, in letters, in receipts, in quiet transactions between shame and survival. And then they disappeared. When we look back at Victorian England, we often imagine elegance, gaslit streets, grand architecture, industrial progress. But behind that progress was an invisible trade. Infants as financial transactions, mothers as liabilities, death as cost reduction. The scandal forced Britain to begin building something modern societies now take for granted: structured adoption systems, regulated foster care, government oversight, every inspection checklist, every child welfare policy, every mandatory report. They all trace back, in part, to a time when no one was watching. And when someone finally did, it was too late for hundreds. The story of baby farming is not just a crime story. It is a warning. When vulnerable people are isolated, when shame replaces support, when profit enters spaces meant for protection, abuse becomes scalable. The Victorian era prided itself on morality, on respectability, on order. Yet beneath that polished surface was a marketplace where innocence had a price. And it took floating bodies in a river to force an empire to confront it. Today, the name Amelia Dyer remains in history books. But the greater lesson is not about one execution in 1896. It is about what happens when society chooses silence, because silence does not eliminate cruelty, it hides it. And in Victorian England, hidden cruelty became an industry that flourished for decades.